evening.
It's Christopher Lambert.
Have a great and productive night. Kick some ass.
There can be only one.
What if Edgar Wright wrote and directed a cross between American Pie and Gremlins set in the snow? I guess you'd have something like The Creeps, a 2025 horror comedy which is actually filmed and takes place in Finland but is spoken in English language. And this one stars Christopher Lambert. Well, I say stars, he's in the movie, but it's definitely a small supporting role. But he pops up periodically through the movie, probably 1 or 2 days shooting. But they've made the most out of that kind of time. Okay, so what's the story? It focuses on 3 17-year-old lads, boys. And they are kind of nerdy types. And there is a kind of party, some type of event, sort of festival or something that's kind of going on around one of them's birthday. So they kind of decided to go to this kind of party. There's various girls there and they kind of want to lose their virginity and all the rest of it. However, this just so happens to be at the same time there is this invasion from another dimension from these creatures that resemble little snowmen. And these creatures are now attacking everyone, and it's up to our 3 nerdy friends and a group of other people to try and find out what is going on, try and defeat these creatures, and maybe get their end away at the same time. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's talk about it. Now, this is like 80s bingo whack-a-mole. There's so many kind of like different references and things that are thrown up on screen here. It honestly feels like, you know, you should have like a checklist for all the kind of the references that this movie has. Now, let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. What can we say in the positive column here? I mean, if you love the 80s, then you may want to check it out, because it is a smorgasbord of 80s references, from some of them being quite overt, like Christopher Lambert, our main kind of sort of teenage protagonist is a big fan of Highlander, and Christopher Lambert actually plays a kind of fictionalized version of Christopher Lambert. So this guy's kind of like idolizing him and stuff. So there's lots of references to Highlander, but there's also sort of other sort of more subtle references through the film, and then just some real random ones like Kit from Knight Rider just shows up and is in a few scenes and then it's never seen again. It's like weird. So, you know, there is a lot of kind of nostalgia here. So if you like a movie which is filled to the brim with nostalgia berries, then you may want to check it out. Now, this is a horror comedy, and I say it feels like it should have been directed by Edgar Wright. It isn't, but it has that sort of manic sort of energy that Edgar Wright brings to his kind of earlier kind of works, and, you know, it has this sort of over-the-top zaniness along the lines of kind of Scott Pilgrim, for example. So in regards to the tone of the movie, it leans very much into that comedic sense. So, you know, it's more on the lines of Scott Pilgrim than, say, Ghostbusters, for example. So this world is kind of hyper-realised. It's not a film where you could say it's kind of the real world, but it's comedic. It's certainly very much an outlandish, over-the-top adventure. But I will say I think some of the kind of the jokes are actually kind of quite funny, and I think some of them are, you know, quite knowingly made for a cinema-going audience. There, as I say, there's a lot of referential nods here, and some of the kind of the gags are, you know, if you're a film fan, you'll appreciate some of these kind of little nods and references, and, you know, even some kind of like cameos and stuff. I will say, I mean, humour is subjective, and there are some that don't work, and we'll talk about that again. But I think, you know, there's a good amount here that I do think works. I think the movie has a certain amount of charm, and I think part of the reason of that is our three kind of teenage lads. They cast people who genuinely kind of look kind of somewhat nerdy. Not like the typical sort of Hollywood versions of nerds that you sometimes get. These, you can kind of see these guys being somewhat awkward with girls and things like this, and having these little moments. And there's some quite sort of like, almost like poignant moments. We have one of our Finnish characters, this one of the three boys, he has a bit of a heart-to-heart about how people kind of like, he doesn't really feel like he has many friends and things like this. So it has a few moments of poignancy there. And there's some elements that I think, that like nerdy guys may kind of relate to. For example, there's these three kind of like attractive women that end up kind of hanging around with them. And they eat these kind of like hash cookies, and all they're doing is they find this sword and they're kind of like nerding out about like Highlander, and they just almost forget about these girls because they're just kind of like nerding out, talking about Highlander and things. And the girls are just kind of sat there bored whilst these three lads are just kind of talking about like nerdy stuff. So there's some definite kind of like elements of kind of charm here and stuff, which is is kind of quite fun. And obviously the biggest kind of reference here and influence is clearly Gremlins, where we have these creatures that very much act like the kind of like Gremlins. They're all sort of like bad attitudey and small and kind of are talking to each other in their language, and we kind of see subtitles about what they're saying and all the rest of it. So definite kind of Gremlins vibes here. And, it's relatively fast-paced movie. So there's kind of plenty of action. It doesn't take too long at all before it kind of really gets going with this sort of invasion of these kind of creatures. And they've made these creatures with a mix between CGI for kind of like wide shots and things, and when they're kind of moving, but they do use kind of practical as well. And they're kind of an interesting design. These little kind of snowman sort of style creatures with like glowing green eyes and all the rest of it. And we have like a final bad guy, which is a kind of a reference to Highlander. So there's certainly some fun elements here, and I do feel this is not a movie where you're going to say the acting was very subtle and kind of like the characters really spoke to me and stuff. But I think the kind of like tongue-in-cheek film that it is, and the obviously the very comedic tone that it's going for. Everyone here, I think, does a decent enough job. Well, certainly with our main cast at least. I think some of the supporting characters, like these two hot babes that kind of follow them around, don't really have much to do. But there is our main characters at the very least. I think you felt you get to know the characters to a degree. So it has an element of fun to it. What doesn't work? So let's stay on the element of fun and humour. Now the humour is obviously, by its nature, is subjective, and not everyone is going to find every joke funny. I do think sometimes these jokes outstay their welcome. You kind of feel that they're sort of, the camera lingers a little bit too long on certain kind of scenes where, okay, the kind of the funny moment has passed now, and now we're just kind of sitting here waiting for the kind of the joke to finish, and it's still sort of carrying on. So there's a few elements like that. I think some of the jokes just don't land. I mean, you're not going to pitch every one, are you? But there are some that I think don't land. Sometimes I think, and I'll be honest with you, I can honestly say I think some people will find this movie a little bit too silly. I think the movie has this kind of over-the-topness that I think might put some people off. Now, this was clearly a decision to do this, and that is why I say this movie is like more Scott Pilgrim, where it's this over-the-top reality, rather than a kind of a Ghostbusters. This is a horror comedy that I always use, which I think got the perfect balance between like drama and comedy, where it's a believable world, but it's genuinely funny and it has funny situations. This is much more going for that Scott Pilgrim, which I always use as an example, where it's very over the top. I mean, maybe it's not quite to the degree of Scott Pilgrim, but it's in that kind of ballpark, so to speak. And as such, because it leans so heavily on the humour, You know, not all of it hits, I have to say. As I've kind of alluded to, although I think our main cast are quite likeable and quite fun characters, I think some of certainly our female characters don't really have a lot to do, if we're being honest. Even our main female character, Natalia, who is kind of like the love interest of our main male character, gets a little bit more to do, but even her, I think, you don't really ever know much about her and her personality and stuff, and the two other ones, they're barely even speaking parts, to be honest. So there is a disparity here between some of the characters. The creatures themselves, I think, are probably the biggest missed opportunity here. This is clearly not a high budget movie. It doesn't have the oomph that the Gremlins films did, or even some of the other films like Critters. This is more munchies. The creatures seem a little bit too derivative of Gremlins, to be honest, without really their own sort of thing. They just seem like Gremlins, but snowmen. The VFX aren't as strong. Neither the practical nor the CGI, I don't think, is particularly strong. How they came to be is like a very hand wavy exposition about they're from a different dimension and there was some machine, and that's basically all you get. I think there needed to be a little bit more build up with them. I also think it would have behooved the movie to have a little bit more kind of set up in regards to our sort of characters, how these creatures came to be, and maybe you didn't need to have I mean, like I said, I think sometimes this movie feels like it's outstayed its welcome, even though it's not a long film. But maybe you could have had a little less of the kind of the zany chick running around in the snow, and have a little bit more kind of work with the characters at the beginning, or a little bit more kind of idea about what these creatures actually are. You know, what their purpose is and stuff, because it's very, very light on that sort of stuff. The movie is more interested in having memory flashbacks about the 80s than it is about anything else, I would say. And it's fun to a degree, but it's fun on a surface level. You never really feel there's a lot of meat on the bones here. And as such, the movie ends up feeling fun but a little throwaway. So, you know, it's a fine movie. In actual fact, I would say it's probably a better than average movie overall, because I do think the elements of nostalgia, the kind of the fast pace, and the kind of the nerdy nature of our characters, and just the general kind of fun the movie has, makes it worth a watch. But I don't think it's going to be remembered really more than you know, not one you'll go back to much, I don't think, in my opinion, at the very least. So for me, it's an above average movie, but just kind of slightly above average. So it's 6 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What are your thoughts? If you have, let me know, and I look forward to seeing you next time.